This is the story of Paul's first missionary journey. So listen for all of the different places that come, and we'll talk about those a little bit during the sermon time. But also listen for how many times the story goes sideways for Paul. There's a lot of unwelcome opposition. The Christians don't quite trust him because of who he was before. And the Jewish leaders don't trust him because of who he's become. So you're going to see that through the whole of Paul's ministry. The opposition is a constant theme. So those are the two things to listen for. Did you notice, this is another thing to notice, that when they leave Antioch, they're called Barnabas and Paul. By the time they get into Asia Minor, by the end of this story, the script has flipped and it's Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas is the lead as they come out of Antioch, and something happens on Cyprus, and Paul becomes kind of the headliner, and it stays that way through the rest of the book of Acts. Very curious how that happened. But it speaks again to Barnabas, who we talked about last week, and his gift of being, his name is the son of encouragement, his gift of encouraging others, lifting others up, lifting up other leaders. So we are on week 5 of this series that we've been doing. We've watched in horror as Saul ravaged the church. We've walked with Saul along the road to Damascus, where he met the living Christ. We met a Damascus Christian named Ananias, which translates, God is gracious. Ananias was called by God to serve Saul in his utter bewilderment. We met the church at Damascus, who warily takes Saul in, teaches him, lets him minister among them, and then they sneak him out of town when his former colleagues threaten his life. Paul gets to Jerusalem. A church there wants nothing to do with him until his friend Barnabas steps in and brings him into the circle of the Christians in Jerusalem. And then when everybody's mad at him in Jerusalem, it's too dangerous for him to be there, he gets shipped home to Tarsus. And there he stays for a number of years. Scholars estimate that in all, Saul served a 13-year internship before he stepped into his life's work. Feels to me like that's about what it takes to become a medical doctor. Shirley, am I right about that? Are you still back there?
Yeah, it says it's about 13 years.
Yeah, 13. So it's a long time. And during that 13 years, it's still Paul is still not ever fully embraced by the Jerusalem church. And I think it's because Saul becomes the possible to the Gentiles in no small part because the Jewish church never quite embraces him as one of their own. That twist of circumstance. He keeps getting sent away for their safety and for his safety and theirs. Our takeaways so far: forgiveness is different than a renewal of trust. Trust takes time and demonstrated trustworthiness. And even after we have sinned or been sinned against, God works a new and different good in each life, while trust is being rebuilt, even if it is never fully rebuilt. That's the story of Saul the scholar become Paul the apostle. And so here he is, launching out as the apostle to the Gentiles. So the next text we've already read. I'm on a place that I found in one of my books that the scholars guess that Acts chapter 13, which we just read most of, it was written about the year 46. So that can kind of keep your timeline, your mental timeline going. And what we read there is that Barnabas and Saul are 2 of 5 pastors in the Antioch church. Antioch, ancient Antioch, is located somewhere near the current border between Turkey and Syria. And it's inland about 15 miles. So this remarkably international pastoral staff is worth noting. There are 2 Africans, 1 pastor from Cyprus, and a Roman who once served in Herod's court in Jerusalem. And then we have Saul from Tarsus. So they are geographically dispersed in where they come from. And it's highly likely that they have ended up in Antioch after fleeing persecution elsewhere in the empire. Because that fleeing from persecution is how the church has grown up to this point. It is the way that most of us experience change. I only welcome change if it's forced upon me for some good reason. I only ever read The Hobbit. I didn't ever get through The Lord of the Rings. Very dense story. But my favorite story from The Hobbit is the very beginning, and is it Gandalf who comes to Bilbo Baggins and sends him off for an adventure, and Bilbo Baggins says, "Oh, adventures are nasty things. They're apt to make you late for supper." That's me. I thought about, tattooing it on my underwear or something. But this congregation decides that it's going to create its own adventure. This outpost congregation has finally grown strong enough and stable enough to sense that God is calling them to intentionally take the gospel to people beyond themselves. So at this point, people have been coming to Christian centers. And this is the first time we see a whole church coming together and sending out missionaries to the Gentile world and not just to other Jewish communities. It is a huge step. They're choosing change, they're choosing adventure. The good news of all of this is that God is gracious and active in both situations. In change we choose, and in change we do not choose. But the question for all of us, this is really about me. The question for me is, what if I do embrace change? What if we see the leading, providing hand of God in it? This is where I got stuck this week on sermon prep, because about this point in my work, we got the news about Dave. And embracing the change that is coming, because this is a change we did not choose. Can I embrace that change, even if it's not clear exactly what it will look like, even if there's no long-range plan with guaranteed reservations along the way? Like Bilbo Baggins did not get to make reservations at the next DoubleTree Inn in every town that he went to. Jesus didn't get to. Paul didn't get to. When God calls us on an adventure that involves change, I would expect and hope that there would be a grand plan, complete with maps and guidebooks, and maybe even a tour bus with Rick Steves hosting. If I'm going to set out into the wild, I always buy the Rick Steves handbook, if it will exist. And I nearly ruined a trip to Istanbul for myself by leaving my guidebook in the airplane seat pocket. And that's just at the point where I learned that you can now download Rick Steves guidebooks and carry them around on your phone. The rest of you do this instead of just cutting out the guidebook into the places you're going that day, so you're not carrying that whole big thick book carrying around. I now know I can grab it on my phone. That's how I travel. I want Rick Steves telling me what to do. But in this situation, there's no expertise. God issues a curiously vague call. Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. There's not a lot of detail here. There's no itinerary, no reservations, no kosher meals on the flight. It's a little distressing. But it seems to be how God operates most of the time. Abraham, Genesis 12, go to the land I will show you. Moses, let my people go. Into that God-forsaken wilderness? For how long? Because follow the fire is not a very detailed game plan. And then there was Jesus, he just kept saying, come follow me. And imagine the disciples trying to explain that to the folks back home. Following Jesus has never been a predictable proposition, and it is not for Saul. He and Barnabas are sent out by the church in Antioch, and we see them just following their noses at first. They head for the nearest port to Antioch at Seleucia, which was about 15 miles away. And reaching that port, they pick as their first destination the island of Cyprus, which was Barnabas' hometown. And when I read this text, I want to think that Barnabas chose first to go home and see his mom, because it may be true. It certainly makes sense that he would want to make sure his family and friends had a chance to hear the gospel. But it's also true that Cyprus is the logical place to go from Antioch. It's straight out into the Mediterranean, the first step towards the rest of Asia Minor. So I played around on Google Images. Here's the ruins at Seleucia, this major port city. And then I fell down a rabbit hole, and I'm not going to drag you down the whole rabbit hole with me. But Seleucia is the capital of what once was the whole Seleucid, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Seleucid Empire. And obviously it has been, the Romans have now taken over that whole part of the world. But it was this center of a great empire of wide commerce and trade. Yes, it's a port city, and it's also a major city in and of itself. And we're not told if Barnabas and Paul said anything, but I like to think that they actually had a gathering in Seleucia, in this great city, to also proclaim the gospel. But anyway, in any case, they get on a boat and they go straight out to Salamis on Cyprus. And again, this is what that bay looks like. There's some fairly ominous cliffs down the way, but it's a port city, and that's where they head on Cyprus. And what we watch from Paul and Barnabas now at this point is that we can only ever just take the next step. And again, this is my Rick Steves plug for all of you who travel. This is my favorite quote from this Istanbul guidebook that I had to download onto my Kindle and my phone. He says, of course, travel, like the world, is a series of hills and valleys. Be fanatically positive and militantly optimistic. If something's not to your liking, change your liking. And Dave and I will say that to each other rather more often. Well, can you change your liking? So Saul and Barnabas have some great adventures on Cyprus. It's a part of the story we're not going to dwell on today, except to note that it was on Cyprus, that this is where his name switches from the Hebrew Saul to the Roman and Greek Paul. And he becomes the leader of the team, and Barnabas begins to set aside. They have a fruitful time on Cyprus. Many respond to the gospel. So far, so good, you can hear them think. But next, when they move to the mainland, significant difficulties start to rise. This is where they leave from Cyprus. So they start on the western edge, the eastern edge of Cyprus, and head west down the island. Who knows how many conversations they had. They end up at the bottom of the island on the far western coast, and they leave from this gorgeous bay, going towards the mainland. And again, I keep wondering at the courage of all of these people, these biblical missionaries. They leave beautiful, comfortable places and go to harder places. I would have set up shop in Paphos and settled in and gone swimming every morning in this gorgeous water. But they leave. Here's a map that sort of gives you an idea. I should have put it in your bulletin for you, but it gives you you can see Antioch and Seleucia. They go to Salamis and Paphos, and then they board a ship and they cross over, and they land in a place called Perga, in an area called Pamphylia. And there they are for a period of time. As you look at this, again, gorgeous picture of where they have landed in Perga. But I want you to look behind this, in the background. I want you to look at those mountains. They're the Taurus Mountains, and they are a big factor in this story. But you have to dig to find out why. Because the team, Paul and team, the next place they go is Antioch in Pisidia. And there again is the ruins of this Roman city, the Colosseum that was there. In his commentary on Acts, John Stott points out, hidden in the verses, in verses 13 and 14, a very significant challenge of geography. From Perga to Pisidian Antioch, as opposed to Turkey, Syrian Antioch, it took them over the Taurus Mountains, 100 miles north. A climb from sea level to 3,500 feet above. So by comparison, Stephen's Pass is 4,000 feet-ish. Why? And what causes Paul to make this journey? Because he's making it walking. There are no interstates, there are no trams, there's no ski lifts. This would have ended my career as a missionary, facing those mountains. I would have been okay getting on boats. But climbing those mountains, that is an adventure that is going to make him extremely late for dinner. But not only that, Paul, according to Galatians chapter 4, verses 13 and 15, by the time Paul reaches Pisidian Antioch, he had a debilitating illness. Scholars speculate that Paul contracted malaria in the marshy lowlands of Perga. And standard treatment for malaria, even today, is to send the sufferer to higher, drier ground. So, was it illness that prompted Paul and team to make that journey over the Taurus Mountains to someplace high and dry? All these hidden little things. This is why, oh, my friends who are Bible scholars, like always, at the bare minimum, click Google and kind of do the geography of these places, because the whole story just changes if you catch a glimpse of the geography. It tells us all kinds of great information. He has another challenge when he gets to Perga. He's fallen ill. It could be that he is so ill that the mission is in doubt. But in any case, John Mark, another biblical character that has come into the story earlier, John Mark leaves this team after Cyprus. We aren't told why, but we learn later in Acts chapter 15 that Paul experienced this as a real betrayal, as a desertion. So he's in a beautiful but sickening place. He loses part of the team. He makes this dangerous journey up and over the mountains, and then the challenge for him is that jealousy and persecution becomes a constant theme in his life. Wherever Paul goes, he is well received by some and a threat to others. And such a profound threat that they can't just write him off. They can't just turn his microphone off. They become life-threatening persecution. So what do we do with Paul's story? As he follows Jesus, his life becomes not just unpredictable, it becomes downright dangerous. The next step after he goes to the city in Antioch, he goes on to Iconium, and then we'll see him do a couple of other spots sort of up along that high and dry spot of Asia Minor. Paul forever challenges our belief that we will recognize the grace of God, the guidance of God by doors that swing open before us and pathways that are made smooth and straight for us to walk on. The ease of our situation is not how we discern the will of God for our lives, although that idea carries a lot of currency in our culture. How quickly do we question a decision we have made when things become difficult? How quickly do I assume I've missed God's will when the path becomes crooked? Paul's pathway was never straight. He is always in a place he does not choose because of circumstances he cannot control, and God is right there with him. So what about you? Are you living now in a place you did not choose? Are there an increasing number of circumstances you cannot control? Is your health or your spouse's health or your geography or your colleagues, or is it something else altogether? What is it? And you may be in one of those gracious periods of life when all is going well. You're on the virtual coast of a lovely Mediterranean island. Thank God that that happens for us at various seasons of our lives. But looking around, we are all old enough to recognize that we could never have predicted the journey that our life has been on. Has anyone's pathway been straight and clear and smooth? Or over your lifetime, have you taken unpredictable side trips to unexpected places? And the good news of our text is that God is never left behind when we take an unexpected turn. The God who was and is to come has been with us every step along the way. So look, remember evidence of God's grace in your past. See where God is at work every day on your current journey. And when the road becomes wildly unpredictable, look closer, for God is there. Lord, for all of this, your presence with us, the company of the biblical story, so we know we're not alone in our journey. Thank you that we have these stories, that they've been compiled and told and retold, so we get to learn from them. We get to know that even those who've had the privilege of a direct confrontation with the living Christ end up in situations they cannot control, and that you have drawn straight with those crooked lines. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.